huge opportunity for you to get in and talk about it, because you're not changing the rules, you're changing the future rules, if you will. So do that when your opportunity is presented to you on that. So that's an important aspect. There's some interesting things that we want to get to in terms of some further discussion. So I'm going to try and motor through this quite quickly with what's left so we can get into some more group discussion in there. So I wanted to talk about sustainable communities, because what I was showing you in terms of a zoning amendment, that could be for anybody doing anything rather conventional. So how does it become a little bit different and a little bit more challenging associated with sustainable communities? So the first thing I do is I like to liken the nature of any kind of a sustainable development to actually being a stool. And in essence, you have triple bottom line accounting, and that refers to social, fiscal, and environmentally responsible initiatives as part of any project. And so it's very important that you don't put your stool out of balance by being totally focused on the environmental and not the fiscal or not the social. And so you're always looking for how that balance comes in there. So what you're seeing here to the right is unfortunately a bit of a sketchy image, but it was part of a presentation for the Cherry Point Marina. And in there, what you'll see is letters in there, S1, E1, F1, etc. Those represent fiscal, social, and environmental issues. And then this was what we had that came with it. So these were a number of the initiatives and environmentally sensitive elements that you're incorporating and how you're incorporating them into that so that they have so that they're recognized for their sustainability elements in there. So this was done a number of years ago, and unfortunately that project had a problem with an access for a sewer connection to the Lambourne sewer system, and it effectively killed the project after going to the Supreme Court to argue it between two neighbors. But I'm not going to get into that sad aspect of it. So then we talk about as well how we integrate things like green principles and permaculture, and a number of these things are maybe a little bit more relevant to the nature of the residential scale of what you might be working towards. And so these become principles that you want to also explore and find ways to integrate into your sustainable community in there. The internal land use designations in there, this is a very unique aspect that arose in part, and I go back to my story I told you at the beginning here about the high school students and the importance of being able to create something that people could see. So when we were before the Cowichan Valley Regional District Board, and we said to them that we wanted to create an intentional community where the community gathered around practicing sustainability. That is truly the definition of what an eco-village is. This is just an intentional community where sustainability is the glue that brings everyone together. So the board members looked at one another and said, wow, well, we've written sustainability into our OCP, of course we want to support it. So at the end of the day, we got unanimous support for it as we were moving forward. And then I said, but you know what, there's an important aspect here. And so I sat down and I shared that story about the high school class in Toronto that I dealt with, and how it is even more important that they provide a designation for the allowance for workshops and programs and education within there. And so in essence, what we ended up doing was they said, okay, but we're not going to say that you can use the entire property for that. We actually, even though the zoning was for Rural 5, which in essence became the eco-village, we were able to designate within that. So this image here is an image that shows 4 sectors within our eco-village. There is a woodland and wetland conservation sector, which is the area down the bottom and wraps around, and that was all about protecting the large pond and the wetland that was down below. There was another sector which is in the middle, which is the agricultural sector, the area that was to be used for farming. There is a cluster of housing that is over in this area, and clustering your housing becomes a very important principle in sustainable communities because you bring all your services to one common area. And then you ended up in the middle in there, this area, I guess I should use the laser, in there, which is the educational area or institutional component within there. And so that gave the latitude for Brandy and her colleagues to be able to teach permaculture and to teach alternative cob construction and alternative renewable energy. All of these alternatives are expressed in there because we were able to create that designation in there. So it's important when you do your project, you think about that. So I'll share another idea in there. There's a project up in Haida Gwaii that I'm working with. And so they have a vision, first of all, to have 7 small homes in there, and then we've created a common house in there as well, so that they needed to put a couple of guest bedrooms in there, so each of their homes didn't have to be larger to accommodate their friends and family that come to Haida Gwaii, because as they say, when people come to visit us, they stay a long time, because it's hard to get here, and so you want to be able to stay. So they actually created a common house with multiple bedrooms in there, and places for laundry and socialization that they didn't have to do in each individual one. And then up against the road, in their interest for being able to generate income, they have got a designation through the zoning amendment process that we've completed to be able to have a workshop with a small cafe, a gift shop, and to be able to teach courses in there in renewable energy and alternative septic and things like that. So that was done. Again, the same principle of creating sectors and allowances for different components within that property. I'm working with a group that's just started up in Qualicum called the Valterra Village, and they're looking to bring a group of people together in a co-housing environment. They have access right against the main road where we will put the commercial designation for that property where they can do economic activity on that property. So sectors become an important way to look at the development of a sustainable community. The communal services and the economies of scale. This is one of the unique aspects, and I just spoke to some of it being the aspects of a common house or a common workshop space, shared spaces. These become important components of any sustainable community because part of what you're trying to do is consolidate and allow people to share. So a lot of that is multifunctional, whether it's the common house in the middle that is used as a daycare during the day, it's where everybody meets for social gatherings and decision makings on the part of the community, and maybe where the recreation, maybe there's a Tuesday night poker in there, or people are playing bridge on a Thursday, or it's used for some other function of the teenagers of the community. So look at that in terms of common spaces. Another aspect of it is that we recognize in sustainable communities is economies of scale. This is a picture out in Salmon Beach. I don't know if many of you would know where Salmon Beach is near Ucluelet. It's a recreational community, very ecologically sensitive. At the time that the community we went forward and I assisted in the zoning amendment, everything was off the grid there. There was no water system, there was no electrical. Since then, electrical has been added because of a treaty agreement with the First Nations, and the electrical was dragged down past here, and the community voted to bring it into the community. But at the time when I did this, we got an allowance for what we called common service buildings. And the ability of that is that inside of that building, we could create an extra building on our properties that could house a battery bank and an inverter that could be shared by 4 different cabins out at Salmon Beach. So we didn't have to have every individual owner own their own system, even though we had solar panels located across all of the cabins, all brought back into that one common. So you can take advantage of things like economies of scale in the nature of how that you're proceeding in there. Another option, for instance, at Kirkstone is that we have a circumstance where many of the homes got a wonderful exposure for solar. We can put lots of PV on there, and I don't know how much this community knows, but the photovoltaics is the way of the future in many, many ways. And I know Guy would have shared that last week as well. The costs of that has come down dramatically over the years. But we also have a creek running by, which means that there's some trees there that we can't cut down. So there's a handful of trees in there that aren't going to get any real good solar exposure on there. But we have the ability for them to pay for solar panels and put them on their neighbors' houses and bring some of that electrical back. So you have that opportunity. Another one is geo-exchange, the ability to grab heat from the ground and bring that back up. When you do it in a one-off situation in an isolated house in the middle of 5 acres, that could be a $40,000 or $50,000 investment. When we did the initial calculations based on a cluster of houses and doing one system that linked in and provided heat to all of them, it was suggested to us we were looking at about $12,000 to $14,000 per house to be on a district system. So that became very unique in terms of an opportunity in there. So economies of scale become something that can be valuable. I'll share with you how that's morphed a little bit for us though since then. The hurdles of being a trailblazer in there. So one of the great challenges that we have, and I have bumped my head against this many times over, is that when you go forward with an initiative and you want to do it, the first thing the planners go, whoa, we've never seen that before. Nobody has ever told us they wanted to put a community together that is 100% rainwater harvesting, where every house is going to get all of their water. We did detailed calculations and we determined at Kirkstone that we needed 600 square feet of roof and appropriate size cisterns, and we could get all of our water supply, potable and non-potable, using water conservation strategies within the homes, that 600 square feet was all we needed per person in order to meet that. So we did that. But when we went to the regional district and said, hey, here's our report, this is our analysis, this is how we know that we can do it. And I have designed a house out in Yellow Point that is 100% rainwater harvesting based on a system, and it's a much bigger home than that. The reality is that the planners went, whoa, okay, that's really interesting, and we'd like to support you, and we would like to give you the increased density, but what if there's a drought, or what if we don't get a lot of rain one year? Then there's going to be chaos in your community, so we're not going to give you that zoning amendment unless you connect to the community system. So now we're in a situation where we have to connect to the community water system for our potable water, but to not be hypocritical because we're trying to be a model sustainable neighborhood there, we also want to harvest rainwater. So now we have 2 different water systems in there, and we need to have purple pipe in there for rainwater, and we have to have regular pipe in there, conventional water, and we're basically double plumbing it. So that becomes an extra cost for many sustainable neighborhoods, both in time delays, doing extra reports where one engineer is asked to approve another engineer's work. That can be extremely frustrating, and then you end up in the duplication of systems. But there's a creative advantage to that in the sense that one of the unique aspects of a zoning amendment is that the local government is in the process of taking a piece of property, let's say it's allowed currently 1 or 2 homes on it, and you're going to get them to approve you so that you can potentially get 6 or 8 homes on there. Well, now the value of that land just went up. And so the community says, wow, you know, we've just helped you out financially. We need you to give something back to the community, and it's called community contribution. Some developers have other names for that process. The circumstances of it is that when I sat down with the planners and we talked about it, they said to me, so Jack, this Kirkstone project, this is really exciting. What are you going to give us? What's the community contribution? Are you going to give us a bunch of money we can put towards buying a park, or they want to put a footbridge over the Nanaimo River? We could contribute to that. There might be some trail development. We could maybe pay for a skate park in the community. So they were asking us what we could do, and I said to them, you know, you have forced us by the nature of insisting that we connect to community water, and we know that we're going to do rainwater, that we're going to have dual systems. So we're already paying extra cost, but why don't we use this as an educational means? So the agreement that we have standing as it is now on that project is that they are actually saying if we're willing to do an open house on a scheduled basis going forward, where people can come in and see rainwater harvesting and see water conservation, then they're going to accept that as our community contribution, and there's not a nickel of cost in there. A little bit of data, you know, a once a year loss of privacy on the part of some of the residents that will open up their homes. But that is a unique creative approach to dealing with community contribution if you've got the extra costs associated with sustainability, because people want to see how that is educational. and how they can learn from it. And of course, if you go back to my passion of creating positive alternatives, it's what I wanted in the first place. I want everybody to come in and see what water conservation looks like and rainwater harvesting looks like, so they can adopt it into their communities. And maybe water won't be as big a problem in the future as we think. Another one I want to speak to there is keeping up with technological change. So I mentioned earlier that we had explored the idea that we were going to consider a district system, one geo-exchange system coming up in multiple houses, and then that would work for us for a heating system, and it was coming in at 12 to 14,000. Since then, we've become introduced to the option of going to passive house standards in our homes. So when you build a passive house standard, which is super conservation, very heavy insulation, vapor barriers, triple pane windows, etc., you don't need heat in that building at all. So the geo-exchange system suddenly became redundant in the nature of the way we're going. We're now recognizing that photovoltaics may very well be providing sufficient energy for our homes within there. And so one of the things that's really unique about in the world of sustainability, with so much research and development on this planet, is that even in the time it takes to get through a process in all of its development stages, we're finding new technologies that are coming in. So you must go into it with an element of flexibility and say that, even though we're planning to do this, we might see even more things happen here that will be even a better option for us. So don't pigeonhole yourself in and say, okay, we're committed to that, because there may be something that arrives that's even better as you move forward. So the tiny home communities, and I wanted to speak to that a little bit here, the challenges that they face. And I reached out to a couple of planners in different jurisdictions to ask them what their thoughts are about it. And during my research, I came upon that wonderful quote at the top there by Jenna Robinson on a website there. And I thought, you know what, that just says that so well, about the nature of that whole new rage of the tiny home community. And I think it's really, really exciting. But when I got into talking to the planners about it, they said, oh, you know what? We are talking about that in the staff room now, over lunch. What are we going to do with tiny homes? Because everybody wants to consider doing them. So how do we deal with this as an option? Because it is a very viable idea in terms of making it affordable for many in there. So one of the first things they talk about is building code. So we put these codes together that say that we want health and safety for anybody that's occupying in there. Do the homes that are being built, do they meet those building code standards? Are they done to the BC Building Code? Is there an engineer who's willing to come in and certify that those areas that you're getting away from current code standards are still considered acceptable, and he's prepared to put a stamp and put his liability against it, that you're not going to get sick because the building envelope is not going to end up causing mold problems or something like that within there, or that the building isn't going to flip over in an earthquake and you're going to end up in challenge there. So that aspect of tying in building codes becomes a critical piece of the discussion that the planners are currently wondering, how do we do this? If it's on wheels and it was CSA approved, like a park model trailer or an RV, then they have no issue with it. You can put that wherever you want. I mean, there's certain concerns in some municipalities that you don't start piling a bunch of RVs and people living in there, because that becomes, but the different ways are, it either meets the building code, it's CSA approved, or you get an engineer to sign off on it in there. So then there's the question of connecting to services. So what happens there is that a piece of property that is, let's say, an acre in size, and it has an allowance for one home, there's no limit on the size of that home in most of these bylaws. So you could build a 6,000 square foot home on there. So if people came by and said, wow, gee, we're going to put in a tiny home on here. So let's take 6,000 and divide it by 400 square feet for a tiny home. And my goodness, who's doing the math? What is that, 15 homes or something like that might end up on there in the same footprint, the same density, the same floor area ratio as to what the giant home is. But what's the difference there is that you've got 15 families or 15 couples or maybe individuals living in there, whereas that giant 6,000 square foot house may only have had a family of 6 in there. So your numbers of people that are now using the services that are in the streets, etc., that you're connecting to may not be what was originally planned in there. And so there's a concern on the part of the planners that the nature of how we figure out how the density works so that we can just apply it to any particular zone becomes a challenge in its own self. I speak a little bit to that in the third bullet there as well. There's also a concern with respect to what is the impact on property values that a tiny home community might look like, because in many cases we look and we see the ones that are shown on the Home and Garden show on TV, and those are spectacular homes and stuff like that. There's a lot of them that don't necessarily look quite as well, and if you weren't putting the effort to make sure that aesthetically they had some appeal, they might negatively impact your neighbors and they may have some concern. So anytime you're dealing with a zoning amendment, how are the neighbors going to react? Is this going to drop their property value? So you have that aspect that is played in there. And then there's the question of ancillary uses. You know, if you're creating tiny homes and you have a community of them, you know, 8 or 10, where are you going to meet for social gatherings on a rainy night? You know, can you get everybody all in one of those tiny homes in the living rooms that might otherwise comfortably fit 4 people? You know, so do we need to create a common space in there? So that's a separate designation than just it being a dwelling unit unto itself. And what about the extra storage, and where are we going to keep our skis and our mountain bikes and all of those things that the tiny home doesn't have? So the planners worry about that and how we're going to factor that in there. So when I got to talking about them and how we could move forward, they spoke about, you know, getting either CSA, building code, or engineer certification on them, and then they're much more comfortable with them as far as a building permit's concerned and allowing them to be a safe option for people to live in. What about a land use designation? As I mentioned, don't find existing bylaws in here that say that we need to have this is a community that's made for it. The OCP needs to address that, and we need to move forward. So what the planners said to me in both jurisdictions, they said to me, you know what we really need is we need someone to come in with an application, because instead of us just kicking it around the coffee room, we actually will have to sit down and figure out how we're going to do it. And in the process of that, you're going to set a precedent. And then that precedent is going to be able to be captured there and moved over and be used in another electoral area within the same regional district, or maybe moved to the next jurisdiction. Because now there's already somebody that's gone out there and figured out what is the type of servicing that we need, what is the allowance for common buildings, how are we going to deal with everybody being connected to a common sewer system. You know, when we try to connect all of them to a common water system, we create a utility. That utility has to be managed. That's an extremely expensive option. So one of the things we try to do, especially when we're talking about rainwater harvesting, is water that's collected on one roof, is stored in one, has its own filtration system, and that water comes forward as for one home only. You are not then being part of a utility. The minute that you have one, so the economies of scale for water don't work, is what I'm saying, based on island health regulations, because if the water is coming in and it's going to 2 different homes, then who's responsible for that? You now have to become a utility, and that, the cost of managing, checking your water, etc., becomes a problem. So it's a thing that we try to avoid in there. Another one that I should point out to you around the scale of communities is that 5,000 gallons a day discharge into a septic field is acceptable under the Ministry of Health requirements, which are much less stringent. If you have a community that is producing more than 5,000 gallons a day in terms of its daily effluent, then it has to be approved under the Ministry of Environment standards. They are much more stringent, much more expensive. So the scale of the Kirkstone development is based specifically on making sure that we are under a Ministry of Health limitation. That is what is actually limiting the density of that particular development there. So what we're talking about here really in terms of the tiny home movement and the challenges is that we need somebody to be a trailblazer. I hope that person or that group are part of the faces that I'm looking at right now. But you know, there is a trailblazer that has gone out in this community and set a ton of precedent and educated so many. So I'm going to turn this over for a few minutes to my good friend Brandy, who I know is going to talk a little bit about the boogeyman. So.
Image of jumping like a circus animal through hoops just to get out here when you said that. Sorry? Yeah, would that go up? Thank you. So thank you so much, Jack, for coming down back to the Cowichan and for all you bring and for all that's been.
And that, I want to put this slide up there to thank all of you for thinking sustainably and thinking about the future and thinking about our grandkids. And so I don't say that generic anymore. Those are my two oldest grandsons, and you know, we're going to change the world for their sake, not for ours.
And I think it's important to loop it back to you as well, Guy, with a thank you, and hugely mostly to you, Lacey, for kicking all this conversation into a higher gear again. So I kind of reminisce back to the days of sitting in potlucks with you, Guy, through the 90s, and we had all just kind of heard this term eco-villages. And then somewhere after a million potlucks and landing on the ground in a place with a team of people that called the space our eco-village, meaning you, Jack, and you being like great enough to show up and say, I would put on a suit and tie and go into the regional district's office with the team. And that's really what I think has all of us standing here today to help move this forward. So I want to, Kemp's just said to me, the difference when you talk about this is you tell a story. So now I feel beholding to tell a bit of a story about actually making it real on the ground. And we also talked about maybe filling in a few pieces that we want to think about when we're talking about what is sustainable community. What does that mean? And that's a term that's used very broadly, and some people say, can it just be simple? Can a couple friends just live together sustainably and have homes? And other people want to have tiny house neighborhoods, and other people want to have slightly larger development processes. But I think what you've nailed is, no matter what, there's a land use allowance when you live on land. And it's called the zoning, and all those little pieces in the flow chart come into play no matter who we are, no matter what the amount of people is, somehow we have to take on those major barriers to sustainable community. So as the story goes, when our eco-village started to move from 10 years in an urban environment into a rural environment in 1999 and come to the Cowichan, we actually came here first. For me, I was coming home, but there was 5 of us, and we came to the 2 governments of this community in respect before coming in to do development work in somebody else's community, like that international stuff is sometimes, and spoke to Cowichan tribes and the CVRD and said, this is who we are, this is what we hope for, there's a little bit of skills we bring and resources, would we be allowed to serve in the community in this way? It wasn't like we're coming in, we got the good thing, we know what we're doing, and you gotta eat this up. It was a respectful entry into what about, which really landed the conversation very differently when they told us, I'm not really sure what you're talking about. People never spoke the word permaculture in those days. They said, go away, make a plan, and come back. Can you show us something of what you're blah, 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 talking about? And so we did. We came back with a literal design, but we actually had to define what that would look like when you want to live together. And great people doing great things will have great outcomes and all those hopes. And I think it's important to not just take the information that was just said and go, oh my gosh, that's kind of overwhelming, and what about? Because there's 2 very high skill sets we had that now you've just lost one of perhaps, but when we started at our eco-village. And one was outrageous optimism, Think about that. And the other was extreme naivety. So maybe you're not as naive anymore. And really it is a skill, because if you don't jade yourself with the idea like, oh no, we can't, and they're gonna get us, and the boogeyman, and the big bad regulatory processes, you might permaculturalize your thinking and go from the problem is the solution, which is literally a quality of design in permaculture. So really, if we think about it as a barrier, where can it become an asset? And you've just done such a great job of showing like how zoning has actually answered itself in so many ways and used zoning to protect things or to implant rainwater harvesting into the approval process. Or I know in Nanaimo, there's actually an eco-village zone designation now, correct? In the OCP?
There's the model sustainable neighborhood designation.
Okay.
It's a green community that they're promoting, but it's not an eco-village yet.
Okay. So the language is happening though, and that's now, so 17 years that we've been on this journey. And there's a difference when we talk about sustainable community, there's a continuum. So there's everything from eco-villages, which, thanks for describing that, Jack, to co-housing. And that is more like a subdivision by design that is much more intentional in its way of living together. Not necessarily working together, not income sharing together, maybe yes, maybe no, growing food together, maybe yes, maybe no, on other kinds of shared aspects of life, but that would change the zoning too, because the more you want to share other things, like shared economy, it's probably going to impact what you're doing on the land and impact the zoning. And then there might be just something like sustainable neighborhoods. And so we're talking about all of that. When we talk about sustainable community, there is people in this room that see themselves like, really intimately, I want to connect with a group of people, live my life together, co-create, do a bunch of magnificent things, share and interact in many ways. Actually, I just want to kind of share land together. I don't really want to be in my neighbor's business. I'm not so interested in what Fred's kids are doing and whether they're going to go to university or not and be a part of their life everlasting. But I'm willing to sit on a council that will help run the land, but we're going to be kind of separate in what we're doing. Probably not sharing businesses and so forth. And then neighborhoods, communities, how do we share in other ways? And maybe any one of that could be tiny homes as well, like the question you're embarking on. So there is a whole intentional communities network around the world called IC.org, and there is a whole global eco-village network that defines this, talks about this. We meet all over the world. There's huge bodies of information, knowledge, research, decades of people around the planet that have already been talking about this. So reinventing what we want, I invite us all to go and look at what have other people been doing. Because if we have a flavor or a passion or a sense towards a possibility, we're probably not the first ones that had that thought. And there is no good sense at certain ages in life, especially the ones over certain decades, to start all over again, reinventing the wheel. So what about in the idea of, does anybody know the book by Diana Leaf Christian, Creating a Life Together? If there's
covered all the books last week.
Is it you brought it? Yeah, there's people in the room that want to talk about having shared life. That's kind of your primer book, the checklist of how to create a community and hopefully a sustainable community. So, you know, that was the only things that we were sort of armed with when we started out at our eco-village. We had a sense of this. We kind of knew where we sat in the playing field of that. We were going towards an eco-village design. What does that mean? Who knows? It's as individual and different around the planet, as the people that are there. Large, small, urban, rural, couple of families nestled into a really cozy little farm in Oroville Eco-Village with 10,000 people living together. Actually, we had the great privilege today of having one of the main leaders of Damanhur Eco-Village in Italy come and have lunch with us. and places that did it completely different than anywhere else in the world. And they built the temple of humankind inside a mountain and hid away for forever. So who knows what brings us together and what the possibility is. But can you imagine 14 of us at our eco-village teaming up like good people, gonna do good things? We didn't have any idea really about land use zoning. There was a little bit of rumblings when we went into the CVRD office and they said, go make a plan. But we were like, hey, we're gonna like grow food and make permaculture gardens and we love Cobb. And if anybody knows Elka Cole, who helped start the school at our eco-village of natural building, we just do things. And so somewhere into that journey, we went back into the regional district's office and said, you know, there's this thing called permaculture design and look at all these classes and all these designs. We had base maps, overlays, every aspect of information about the land we were living on. We had thousands of people come through charrettes in some way giving feedback. And somehow it only occurred in the day we walked into the office and they said, you guys are awesome, you're very lovely, but what you're talking about is not legal. Well, how do you do that much work and you find out something's not legal? And at a certain point I thought, I need somebody else who can draw this. And I picked up the phone and that's how we met. And there's kind of a story that again goes on a continuum from there. To set a precedent, you go out and you find other examples that exist, because they do on the planet. This is not new to the Cowichan. We've worked on multiple zonings from being on Providence Farm, called you, Jack, come down to Providence Farm, we need you. Glenora Farm, Elkington Forest. The zoning from our eco-village has been replicated across the Cowichan in very differing ways for affordable housing, to shared community, however that might look. We have 37 other projects we've worked on across the country. I'm working on a couple in central BC right now that are actually quite similar to just a couple families want to live together and they have resources, and how do we succession plan for farmers. And I have to tell you, just to skip ahead to right now, one of the things out of all this conversation that nobody ever talks about in all the work I've ever done is the taxes at the end of the game when you actually get your thing done. And we're just actually struggling with that right now, being back taxed a very large sum of money because we gifted land. That's another conversation, but what you do need to know is that not only through setting precedent with the land use and creating an exemplary model in Canada, and we're actually a case study of Canada Mortgage and Housing, we also created something titled the FOG Project, and that is a whole nother evening, and invite you to come if you really need that kind of support. We had 8 years of funding with government and foundation fundings to have a legal team work with us that worked across Canada with the key stakeholders, from co-ops to foundations to finance to taxes, across the board. Everybody, you need to think about rounds of how do you create shared land projects. How do you finance them, how do you own them, and how do you govern yourselves to make decisions that are participatory, replicable, accountable, that kind of model. So I just want to kind of take our hats off to everybody in the room that actually has the courage to imagine living differently than just our single family dwelling, individual, rugged individualism kind of lifestyles, not just because we want to be affordable in our lives, not just because we want to be low footprint, not just because we realize it's the ethic of the actual environmental imperative to start sharing resources, but also because we have the courage of heart to stand up, count ourselves in as somebody who's going to work not just for the money, because I can look at the people in the front row here who are doing stuff, not just to benefit yourself to get a home, but to work for some wider good. And I imagine that of the people in this room tonight. So I want to stop there and invite you, yes, you want to continue the conversation about the legal things that go beyond zoning as well. There's a classic example right in your neighborhood, and there's more conversation to be had. And thank you, Lacey, for bringing this forward and making this happen, and Cody teaming up and helping her. And I know Guy wants to create the possibility of us actually seeing each other face to face, and maybe you'll help facilitate that, or you wanna go to Q&A first?
Yeah, I think that's, hopefully there's some
Okay,
questions.
so to brave
who's
hearts,
able-
Heichka.
Thanks, Stu.
Yeah.
Just to check on timing, we really need a good 15 minutes for some organisational stuff together. How many hands up can stay till 9 o'clock? Well, hands up. Who can not stay till 9 o'clock? Okay, just a few. So we can then do 10 minutes of questions, Q&A, then we've still got time for that planning stuff.
Absolutely.
And if you're leaving, last week we did an email list. If you were not here last week and you want to keep in the circle, there's an email list sign up here with the choice of 3 things with to join my list about my work around my book, Journey to the Future, the Green Diary I published, and then the Lacey's Collective Earth email list. So just sign up on the way out if you're not on the list already. Q&A.
Anybody have any questions? Please, ma'am.
Well, you were going to come back to this question about zoning. So when a group is starting out and they're looking for some land, you don't just go out and say, oh, I like this piece of land or that piece of land. My thinking's been that you try and identify what the zoning is of the land and what's the closest type of zoning that's close to potentially allowing for some larger development on that land. So I wonder if you could say more about that.
Yeah, ultimately, you're absolutely right. The critical piece there is that if you can find a piece of property that is already zoned for it, that's a bonus. More often than not, you're probably getting into gray areas where the existing zoning isn't there. So the next most important thing is to review the official community plan and make sure that the OCP is supporting that on a piece of property. So every piece of property has an OCP designation and it has a zoning designation. So the zoning prescribes exactly what you can do now. The OCP says this is what we want this property to be in the future. So do make sure you check your OCP and see whether that's something that you would be able to easily change. Because if the OCP doesn't support it, now you're into a much bigger process changing the regulations for that use.
But still, wouldn't you be looking for, say, I don't know, an R4, multiple families as opposed to an F1 or something like that?
You know, I was approached at the break by a young lady from North Cowichan, and she indicated that there's some interest there in being a little bit more creative with the use of land. And so you will find from jurisdiction to jurisdiction that there are certain jurisdictions that are much more supportive and favorable to innovative ideas. And so it is worthwhile to explore them. You might find things in the Gulf Islands that you can do over there that may not be as supported elsewhere. I can tell you that the Cowichan Valley is much more receptive to creative, sustainable ideas than what you get up in the regional district of Nanaimo. And I'm frustrated by that as someone living up there wanting to change the world and starting with my backyard. Thank you. Question, ma'am?
Do you think the regional districts would be more open if a community, like a rural community, there would be properties that, as a community, they're more interested in being open to tiny houses? Like neighbors, say, 6 out of 10 neighbors on acreages. If they're all interested in that community, do you think?
You know, that's certainly an important decision when you're looking for land, is that not only do you want to confirm whether that piece of property has appropriate zoning designations, etc., you want to find out whether the neighbors around there are supportive of that type of an idea too, because they're the ones that may either want to expand into that idea, or they'll be the ones that'll be standing up at a public hearing opposing your development, and it won't be able to move forward. So it is important to recognize that. There's something that was mentioned to me, and I just want to touch bases before I forget about it. There are a number of different groups that we have in this community and up and down the island. As I mentioned, there's a group in Qualicum that's just starting out, similar to this, etc. And maybe we need to create an alliance of sustainable communities, and so that we have, a gathering of people that are collective in this, all seeking for creating sustainable communities in their own vision, their own model. As Brandy points out, they can all have their own different flavor within that. But if they collectively are able to go back to a local regional district and say, how do we make this thing work here? Then there is the circumstances that the collective as an alliance may be able to get better change than an individual group will. And so there's value in bumping together. Not only that, but you've got the economies of scale of bringing in experts who can speak generally to the issues that are pertinent to each, even though you may still have your own specific design projects. The group I'm working with in Haida Gwaii, you know, they are very self-sufficient in what they're able to do. They contact me when they've got some specific problems. So they've done a lot of their own design, figuring, walking the land. I did go up to Haida Gwaii and visit it, but it's, you know, a lot of people can do this on their own and avoid, you know, that and use the economies of scale of the experts too. Sir, in the back.
The Haida Gwaii project sounds really interesting. You're talking about it with the internal land use sectors. And
Yes.
they've got like 7 families and looking at communal areas, workshops, and so on and so forth. Is there information on those models that's available for sharing, or is it really just their information right now? And is it possible to use the internal land sectors with other municipalities? With other municipalities, then the Cowichan look at this and go, Cowichan's done this, this is looking pretty good, it's been well thought through, maybe we can do this. Is there any advantage to that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Certainly the idea of the internal sectors becomes a really interesting idea, but it tends to be very specific to the comprehensive development zone because it's site specific and they're trying to figure out, they want to say, okay, we will allow you to do agriculture in an area here, or we'll allow you to do commercial workshop, have a workshop or run educational programs, but we want to designate certain areas. So it becomes very site specific. But when I was working with the people in Haida Gwaii and I referenced the work I had done at the Eco Village, they said, oh, show us that. We'd like to see that because that would help us in terms of us being able to decide how we're going to do the one in Haida Gwaii. So there is an overlap there that is valuable in sharing that. But the nature of the internal, it becomes very site specific and group specific because it all depends on what you have on your property. Is there wetland you need to protect? Maybe it isn't. You know, is there an interest in commercial activity? What's the nature of that commercial activity? In the case of Haida Gwaii, they're in an area with very few services. So in order to attract tourists, they got support to have a cafe. And that actually came out of their community charrette when neighbors came forward and said, gee, we used to have that wonderful little cafe down the road where we all stopped in the summertime and get ourselves an ice cream. Nobody does that anymore. Could you guys do that for us? So that got rolled into it, and the planner said, wow, we like that idea. There's a question, sir.
You mentioned, obviously, that the building code changes quite often, but the OCP not so much. How often did you mention that the OCP?
The official community plans are generally targeted to be addressed about every 10 years, but to be honest, it's a long process with many local governments. They involve citizens committees, so some of them can sometimes be 15 years between actually making their changes, etc. on that. Others are a bit more proactive depending on the nature of their community and whether they feel that there's some real strong direction. You should also understand that there's another level of document above an OCP, which is above the zoning document, and it's called a regional growth management plan. And so the regional growth management plan, such as imposed in the regional district in Nanaimo, actually provide some direction to what the electoral area OCPs can do and what the city of Nanaimo can do and what the town of Lantzville can do. So there is levels of regulation in there, so it's important to sort of follow all the way up and see, but the higher you get, the more general the nature of what they're trying to prescribe there. So, you wanted to follow that with a quick question there?
Well, I talked to the planning committee a while ago in the CBRD, and they seem to be actually quite interested in doing alternative things and having people from the community coming to some of their committee meetings. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you that most jurisdictions have written sustainability into it. They're encouraged by the provincial governments, to find ways to incorporate that. And a lot of them are terrific-minded young people that are going like, we want to be better for our community. We need some help. We need input from the community. So those opportunities for forums and stuff to get together and have that, and have those discussions, encourage that, and that's why I say an alliance would have that much more power to be able to go in and have conversations, and maybe you drag in a planner from the North Cowichan and the CVRD and the town of Duncan, and all of them are sitting in, discussing it and trying to figure out how it fits within their own planning structure in there. So, question up front, and I saw one over here, so we'll come back to that one.
Will you just touch briefly on the changes in land taxes that people can, in really broad terms, changes in land taxes that people can expect, and if you know of any strategies for mitigating an increase in land tax zoning from, say, single dwelling to maybe 5 or 10 or something?
That's a tough one in the sense that the assessment authority, that is, once the zoning comes in and it's in place, things don't happen overnight because there's actually no real development there. But as that development starts to change and buildings start going up, they're gonna come in there and reassess it and say, wow, this is worth a lot much more. The value goes up, therefore the taxes go up, and they will recognize the fact that the land use designation has changed as well. So, Brandy?
I actually want to address what you were asking a minute ago, but I'll tag on that one and just say that as a community service, much like you talked about how Kirkstone offered, we have planners come in from all over the province, and actually people from around the country that come and analyze the zoning designation. We have building inspectors that come, and people want to build a clubhouse, so they bring a building inspector over to our building inspector on site. But we actually teach planning students who have come and lived on site with us from the University of Northern British Columbia. And so if you really have zoning challenges, there's people in the Cowichan that have brought their area director to the village and sat and hashed out some of their ideas with them and gave an example instead of just a theory or words. And in terms of taxes, we're trying to do a precedent piece right now around land transfer tax especially. And for succession planning, if you want to keep the former owner involved in the land, and also on tax shifting. So there's a lot of stuff. That's kind of like the next piece that has to be solved.
Community land trusts might have an interesting thing because the focus on them is to keep the land at a constant value. So that is another way that might address taxes. But I did have one more hand up here, and I want to make sure I get this question because I think we want to sort of bring it into more circular discussion here. So
thank you. First of all, thanks everybody who made this evening possible. It's great to be here. Thanks for the great presentations. My question has to do with the encounter between intentional communities and existing community. I've visited and lived in some intentional communities. What I find most interesting and sustainable is where the people who are already in a certain area are considered part of the community and we work together. And you kind of piqued my interest talking about infrastructure and economies of scale. And I'm wondering two things: organizations and I guess government attitudes for that would support that. So I'm imagining, let's say you have an area where there's some people who have single-family houses, right? And then you have people moving into that area who want to do a kind of more intentional thing. Let's say they come up with some innovative septic thing or some PV or whatever. Are there ways that they can share their benefits with the people who are there, and likewise for them to, I guess, for the people who are there to feel more involved in what they're doing and contribute their skills and experience?
That's very interesting and question, because what I spoke about with the idea of a charrette is really to reach out to your neighbors, to the community, because what happens initially is the minute you start talking about doing something sustainable, something different than conventional suburbia, then those that live in suburbia get, ooh, it's a little bit, what are you guys going to be doing? You should have heard the questions when we said we're doing an eco-village. Oh, what do you guys grow there? All kinds of insinuations. And of course, when we actually went to the APC, which was the citizens, they had a bigger push-off to us than the actual board did. The board was going, wow, we really like what you're talking about. They understood it. But the citizens were much more skeptical about it. So it is important that you share with everybody around you what your intentions are, as opposed to trying to do something in isolation and then say, wow, you're gonna love what we're gonna do here. They're gonna go, whoa, we weren't involved. The charrette aspect is one of the ways to counter that a little bit in there as well. So now I'm very sensitive to the opportunity here that those who wish to stay and bring it down to a circle, maybe Guy, I'll let you take some leadership here in organizing us and how you like.
So we want to do one thing quickly, to try and get a photograph of everyone, and to do that, can you all just shuffle into the middle of your rows? So cuddle up